I always thought my family was broken in a quiet kind of way, like a cracked glass no one wants to throw away but never actually drinks from again. But it was in the summer before my final year of college when the cracks in our home finally shattered into something sharp and loud. My name is Erin, and I was 21 years old when my dad cornered me in our kitchen, his hand resting on the cold marble counter like he owned every decision I was ever going to make, his voice flat and cold as he told me, "You will be attending your sister's wedding, or I will stop paying your tuition." It was a sentence delivered with the same calm as someone reading a weather report, but it hit me like a hurricane. My sister Hailey was the golden one, the sun in my father's universe, the girl who could do no wrong, while I was always the one standing in her shadow. When we were younger, she got the big birthday party, the expensive ballet classes, the framed pictures in the hallway, while I got a pat on the head and a reminder not to cause trouble, and that difference never changed, it only grew sharper over time. So when Hailey announced she was getting married to some guy named Trevor, who she had only been dating for 6 months, everyone in the family started acting like it was a royal event. Invitations were printed in gold foil, bridal showers were held every weekend, and suddenly all of my parents' attention was poured into making sure their princess had her dream wedding. I was okay staying away. I had cut ties with Hailey after she had said some horrible things about me at a family dinner 2 years ago, things that had torn into my self-worth like claws. And when I tried to defend myself, my dad had told me to stop being dramatic. He had looked at me and said that Hailey did not mean it, and maybe you are just too sensitive. In that night, I cried in my car for over an hour, but decided I was done trying to compete for his love, so I moved back to my college dorm early and poured myself into my studies. Now fast forward to that summer, and I had an internship lined up and a part-time job on weekends, and I was only a few classes away from finishing my degree when my dad threw that ultimatum at me, standing in our kitchen with the smell of coffee still in the air and my mom pretending to wash dishes but clearly listening. I asked him, "Why does it matter if I go? We both know she does not want me there." And he looked at me like I had just asked why the sky was blue. "Because she is your sister," he said, "and family shows up for each other." I laughed because it was funny in a sad, twisted way that he could say that with a straight face, considering how often Hailey had gone out of her way to exclude me from everything. When I was 14, she told our classmates that I wet the bed at night. When I was 17, she threw out my college acceptance letter because she was jealous I had gotten an early decision. And when I brought it up, my parents told me she was just being young and silly. So I asked my dad, "What if I don't go?" And he stared at me with this coldness I will never forget. "Then I cut your tuition," he said, just like that, no hesitation, no emotion, like it was a business transaction. I was stunned. I asked him if my education really meant that little to him, and he shrugged and said, "Actions have consequences, Erin." I walked out of that kitchen feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Later that night, I called my friend Mia, who was more like family than anyone in my bloodline. I told her what had happened, and she cursed loud enough for her neighbors to hear. Then she asked me what I wanted to do deep down, and I told her I did not want to go to that wedding, not just because of Hailey, but because I knew I would be walking into a room where everyone saw me as the afterthought, the invisible one. Mia told me to come crash at her place if things got worse, and I felt a little less alone. But when I brought up the issue with my mom, she said maybe just go for one day, pretend everything is fine, and make your dad happy. I asked her if she ever stopped to wonder how much pretending I have done in this family, and she looked at me like I was being unfair, so I dropped it. Spent the next week trying to figure out what to do. I called my academic advisor and asked if there were any last-minute scholarships or options to delay tuition payments. She said not at this stage, and that if I missed fall enrollment, it could push my graduation back by 6 months, which meant losing my internship offer too. Everything I had worked for felt like it was hanging by a string, and the scissors were in my dad's hand. I even called my grandmother, my mom's mother, who had always liked me more than Hailey, and when I told her what happened, she sighed and said, "Your father has always been blind when it comes to your sister." I asked her what she would do, and she said, "Sometimes you have to lose battles to win wars." And that sentence stuck with me as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling fan, wondering how I had ended up being held hostage by my own family. I remembered time when I was 8, and I had made a handmade card for my dad on Father's Day, filled with glitter and stickers, and a message that said "You are my hero," and he had smiled and thanked me, but then held up Hailey's store-bought card and said, "Now this one looks real professional," and I had laughed like it was a joke, but that comment had sat with me for years, and now here I was 21 years old, still trying to earn the kind of love that came so easily to my sister. Eventually, I told myself maybe I could go to the wedding just for one day, stay in the back, avoid attention, and leave early. I told myself it was not about Hailey, it was about my future, my degree, my independence, and I hated that my father had this much power over me. But I also knew what it would cost if I let pride win, so I agreed. I told my dad I would attend, but only the ceremony, not the reception, and he nodded like a king, granting a favor, and said, "Good decision, Erin." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him if he realized how much damage he had done over the years, but I stayed quiet and packed my bag with a dress I barely wore and shoes I hated, and the morning of the wedding I drove 3 hours to the venue, which was this fancy vineyard in the countryside with fairy lights and music floating through the air like something out of a movie. People barely noticed me. When I walked in, my aunt gave me a nod. My uncle asked if I was working or studying, and I kept my answers short and cold. I found a seat in the back row and watched Hailey float down the aisle in a white gown, looking radiant and smug. Her eyes flicked to mine for a second, and then away, like I was just another guest, and not the girl who used to share bunk beds with her in a pink room filled with stuffed animals. As I sat there watching her exchange vows, I felt a strange mix of sadness and freedom. Sadness that this was what my family had become, and freedom because I realized I was no longer willing to chase their approval. When the ceremony ended, I left without saying goodbye. I got into my car and drove back to the city, windows down, music loud. And for the first time in a long while I felt light, like I had let go of something heavy, and even though I knew the consequences would come, I also knew I was ready to face them on my terms, because some battles are worth losing if it means you finally stop bleeding for people who never even noticed you were hurt. The morning after the wedding felt like waking up after a long storm and realizing the roof held, but the walls might be cracked. I had gotten back to my apartment just before midnight, tossed my dress into the corner, and collapsed into bed without even washing my face. I thought I would feel proud for going through with it, but instead there was this strange hollow feeling like I had just swallowed a stone. My phone buzzed early with a message from my dad. It said, "Thank you for showing up," and that was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the threat he had made, no recognition of what it cost me. Just a short line, like he was checking off a task on a list. I stared at it for a few seconds, then turned off my phone and buried it under a pillow. I needed silence for a while. The next few days, I kept my head down, focused on preparing for the semester ahead, working extra shifts at the coffee shop near campus and helping Mia with her move to a new place. Mia had always been the kind of friend who never asked for explanations. She just showed up with takeout and bad jokes and made sure you remembered to breathe, and I needed that more than I realized. I told her a bit about the wedding, not everything, just the basics, and she shook her head and said, "Your dad treats you like a pawn, not a person." I knew she was right, but it still hurt to hear it out loud, especially from someone who cared about me in a way my own family never did. A week later, I received an official email from university confirming my tuition was covered and my enrollment secured. I felt a wave of relief, but also frustration, because it meant my dad had followed through only after getting his way, like a king tossing coins to a servant who had finally bowed the right way. I hated that this was how things worked, but I pushed the anger aside and dove into classes, determined to finish strong and walk that graduation stage, no matter how many emotional bruises I collected along the way. Things were mostly quiet for the next month, until one afternoon I got a text from my mom. It simply said, "Dinner this Friday, please come," and I sat staring at it, wondering what kind of trap this was. I had not been home since the wedding, and part of me hoped they had forgotten I existed, but apparently not. I debated ignoring it, but then another message came, this time from my grandmother, asking if I would be there, and I could not say no to her, so I replied sure and immediately regretted it. Friday arrived too soon, and I found myself driving back to that house, the one filled with memories both soft and sharp. I parked in the same spot as always, walked up the same stone path, and rang the bell even though I knew no one else in the family ever did. The door opened, and my mom smiled like nothing had happened, like we were just a happy little family gathering for a meal. Her hug was brief and awkward, and she led me inside where everything looked exactly the same yet somehow colder. The table was already set. Hailey was there in a new dress with her perfect curls, and her husband Trevor sitting beside her like a trophy. She had one. He stood to shake my hand, said nice to see you again, and I gave a tight smile, nodding before sitting as far from them as possible. My dad walked in last, and the room instantly changed. His presence was like a silent demand for attention, and when he looked at me, he gave the same polite smile he probably used in business meetings. Nothing warm, nothing real, just surface-level diplomacy. Dinner began with small talk, mostly about Hailey's honeymoon, and how amazing the resort was, and how Trevor had surprised her with a private boat tour. I sipped water and picked at my food, trying not to roll my eyes or gag. Then my mom asked me how school was going, and I gave a short answer saying it was fine, that I was doing well and excited for graduation, and my dad nodded and said good. If that settled everything, no mention of how close I came to losing it all, no reflection on what he had done to force my attendance at that wedding. Hailey looked at me and asked if I had seen the photos from the ceremony. I said no, and she whipped out her phone, showing me dozens of pictures where she looked like a magazine bride surrounded by flowers and friends and happiness. Then she paused on one photo where I was barely visible in the background and said, "Oh, look, there you are." I smiled tightly again, pretending it did not sting, and said, "Yeah, I was there." Then she leaned in and said, "You know, I was surprised you came. I figured you would be too proud or whatever." And that sentence cracked something in me, because it was not even mean, it was casual, like she truly believed I had no right to be hurt. I looked at her and said I came because Dad gave me no choice. She blinked, clearly not expecting honesty, and then laughed and said, "Well, it worked out, didn't it?" And I wanted to scream, but instead I stood up and said, "Excuse me," and walked out onto the back porch. The air was cooler outside, and I breathed deeply, trying to steady myself. A minute later, my grandmother joined me, carrying mugs of tea. She handed me one and said, "I'm proud of you," and I nearly broke down right there. I told her it felt like I was the only one who remembered what actually happened, and she said sometimes the truth is too heavy for people who spent their lives pretending. I asked her why she still came to these dinners, and she said, "Because I know one day you'll stop, and I want to see you as much as I can before that happens." I hugged her tightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt seen, really seen. After a while, we returned inside, and I told my mom I had an early shift and needed to leave. She frowned but nodded, and my dad said nothing as I walked out. I drove back in silence, hands gripping the wheel, thoughts racing. I kept thinking about how everything felt like a performance, a script everyone knew by heart, but I no longer wanted to play the part I had always been cast in. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes. I stopped answering texts from my mom that were only about Hailey. I avoided calls unless it was my grandmother or someone who actually cared about my life, and I focused hard on school, pulling late nights at the library, studying every detail to make sure nothing could derail my graduation. One evening, I came home to find an envelope taped to my door. It was from my dad. Inside was a check and a short note. It said, "Here's next semester's fee, do not be late again." And I stared at it with a mix of anger and confusion, because he had never come to visit, never asked if I needed anything, just sent money like that fixed everything. I considered ripping the check in half, but then I remembered what Mia had told me once: use what they give you to build the life they never supported. So I took the check, deposited it, and added it to the pile that would eventually free me from ever needing it again. The days passed, and I grew more certain in my choices. I stopped apologizing for existing, stopped making myself small to fit into their world, and began shaping my own space, my own people, my own voice. And as the semester neared its end, I got an email from my department saying I was nominated for an academic award. It was a small recognition, but it felt massive to me because it had nothing to do with my family, nothing to do with Hailey. It was mine, earned by my work, my late nights, my silent battles. I called Mia, and she screamed through the phone, insisting we celebrate, and I smiled for real because I knew this was just the beginning of something better, something mine. And even though the past still lingered like shadows at dusk, I knew they no longer owned my light. The semester rolled forward with the weight of everything I had been carrying slowly melting into the background, replaced by textbooks, research deadlines, and moments of quiet independence that I had earned the hard way. I woke up each morning to sunlight filtering through my window, and the satisfaction that I was almost done, almost out, almost free. The pain of what had happened with my family was still there, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it sat in the back of my mind like an old scar, a reminder of what I survived, but no longer a wound that bled. I spent most of my time between campus and my job, barely speaking to my parents and avoiding anything related to Hailey. I blocked her updates on social media, ignored my mom's passive-aggressive messages about family unity, and filtered every call through the mental question, does this person care about me, or do they just want something from me? Mia was a lifeline through it all, cheering me on with energy drinks during all-night study sessions and dragging me out for ramen when I started to forget what real food tasted like. She never asked me to explain the silence between me and my family. She just understood, and that made everything easier. By the time winter break came around, I had already decided I was not going home. Instead, I told my mom that I had picked up extra shifts and needed to stay on campus, which was true. I just left out the part about not wanting to be in that house where love felt like a business deal, and silence was a weapon. She replied with a simple "Okay, hope you're eating well," and that was the end of it. I spent the break in my apartment, working during the day and using the nights to rest, to read, to plan, and for the first time in years I felt like I had control over my time and space. While other students posted photos of vacations and cozy family moments, I sat on my balcony with a blanket and hot chocolate, watching the city lights, thinking about what my life would look like if I never went back to being the version of myself that chased after their approval. The new year began quietly with snow on the pavement and an email from the university reminding us that graduation was only 5 months away. The countdown ignited something in me, and I pushed harder than ever, submitting every paper, early, attending every class, and making sure my name stayed at the top of every list. By the time February ended, I was sleeping less but smiling more. I felt myself growing stronger, not just academically, but emotionally. I no longer cared if my dad sent money or if my mom asked about my sister's latest accomplishment. I stopped explaining my choices to people who never really listened and started celebrating the small wins, like finishing a project ahead of schedule or finally being able to afford new shoes without checking my account 5 times. Everything felt like it was building towards something greater, something mine. Then in March I received an invitation in the mail, cream-colored thick envelope sealed with gold print. The handwriting was delicate, my full name written in careful letters, and I knew what it was before I opened it. Hailey was throwing a second wedding celebration, a bigger one, this time with extended friends and a more formal reception. Since their first ceremony had been a bit private due to scheduling, I stared at the invitation for several minutes, reading the printed words about love, unity, and celebration, and felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest. I flipped it over and saw a note from my mother, handwritten in the corner. It would mean a lot to us if you came, Erin, and your father is hoping we can all be together again. I placed the card on the table like it burned and walked away. Later that night, I told Mia, and she rolled her eyes, saying, "Your sister really can't go 5 months without needing to be the center of the universe, can she?" I shook my head and said I was not going, and this time I meant it. There was no tuition threat, no financial chain wrapped around my future, just a simple decision made from self-respect and distance. The following week, my mom called and left a voicemail asking if I got the invitation, and I never called back. A few days later, my dad emailed me, short and direct, just like always. He said, "I think it's time you let go of the past and rejoin your family. We are not perfect, but we are blood." And that should mean something. I sat with that line for a long time. We are blood. I whispered it to myself over and over, trying to figure out why it sounded more like a warning than a comfort. I did not reply. Instead, I poured myself deeper into finals applications and part-time shifts. When April arrived, so did a letter from the dean congratulating me on making the academic excellence list for the third semester in a row. I pinned it to my wall beside the scholarship certificates and a small photo of me and Mia holding our favorite street food on a rainy night. These were my real accomplishments, my real connections, my real memories, and they meant more than any forced family dinner or staged photo ever could. Graduation day finally came in late May. Warm skies, crowds of students in black robes, laughter echoing across campus. I stood in line waiting for my name to be called, surrounded by strangers who had become allies in the trenches of stress and late nights. When I walked across the stage, I looked out into the crowd but saw no familiar faces, no dad, no mom, no Hailey, and for a moment I felt a stab of emptiness. Then I locked eyes with Mia, who was standing near the back wearing sunglasses and waving a tiny banner with my name, and I smiled wide because she showed up, and that meant everything. After the ceremony I found her outside, and she wrapped me in a hug so tight it made my eyes water. "You did it," she whispered, and I nodded because yes, I really had. We took photos with flowers and street food instead of champagne and polished silver, and I would not have changed a single detail that evening. I got a message from my mom. It said, "Congratulations, proud of you," followed by a photo of Hailey and Trevor at some beach resort, smiling in perfect lighting. I deleted it without replying. That summer, I found a job in the city, a small but respected publishing firm that offered me a junior editor position, and within weeks I had moved into a tiny studio apartment with creaky floors and the smell of old books, but it was mine. Every shelf, every corner, every piece of chipped paint was mine. Mia helped me carry boxes, and we celebrated with cheap wine and frozen pizza, laughing on the floor. Surrounded by half-unpacked belongings in that moment, I realized I was exactly where I was supposed to be, building something honest from the ground up. No strings attached, no guilt, no shame, just effort and ownership. A few months into the job, I received a letter from my grandmother written in her careful script. She said she was proud of me, that she watched me walk across the stage on the live stream and had cried during my speech even though I never mentioned family. She said she understood why I kept my distance, and though it broke her heart, she would never blame me for protecting mine. I kept that letter in my journal, folded and safe, because it reminded me that even in a world that often felt like it had turned its back on me, there were still people who saw me, really saw me, and that was enough for now. The days after my grandmother's letter felt quieter, somehow, not just in my apartment, but in my chest, as if something heavy had finally stopped shifting around inside me. I went to work each morning with a clear mind, poured myself into manuscripts and deadlines, and tried to focus on each moment. As it came, I started to build a routine that felt like mine, waking up before the sun, walking 2 blocks to the same coffee shop where the barista remembered my order, then heading to the office where I worked in a corner cubicle next to a window that looked out on the city streets. I found comfort in repetition, in the small victories of edited chapters and successful meetings, and when the loneliness came, I let it pass through without guilt. I had learned not to fight it because some holes do not need to be filled, just acknowledged. By mid-August, I had settled into this new chapter so deeply that my past felt like a story I had read once, then tucked away in a drawer. But one Friday evening, as I was heading home from work, I saw a name flash across my phone screen that made me stop in my tracks. Hailey. I stared at it for a moment, the letters glowing like a flare in the dark, before I let it go to voicemail. She called again the next day, then again the day after that, and finally I answered because some part of me needed to hear what she could possibly want. She started with "Hey," and a soft laugh like we were old friends reconnecting after a long break. Then she launched into a story about how she and Trevor were having issues, how marriage was harder than she thought, and how she felt like no one understood her. I stood there holding the phone to my ear, feeling like I had stepped into someone else's dream where my golden sister was suddenly human and broken. She talked for 20 minutes without asking how I was or what I had been doing, then said, "I know we have had our issues, but I really need someone to talk to." I did not know what to say because part of me still remembered every insult, every dismissal, every time she made me feel invisible, and yet another part saw her as just Another girl lost in the storm she built. I told her I was busy and maybe we could talk later. She said okay and hung up, and I stood by my window for a long time watching the city lights flicker like signals from a world that kept turning whether I picked up the pieces or not. A few weeks passed. She kept calling, not every day but enough to remind me that she was trying or pretending to try or maybe just desperate for anyone who would listen eventually. I agreed to meet her for lunch at a small cafe halfway between our places. She arrived in sunglasses and a coat too expensive for the weather. Her smile was tight, and her eyes had that restless shimmer people get when they are trying not to cry. She talked a lot about her job, her in-laws, her fights with Trevor, and I listened mostly in silence, unsure if this was growth or manipulation. She finally said, I have been thinking about the past, and I know I hurt you, and I want to say I am sorry. It was the first time I had ever heard those words from her, and for a moment I did not know how to breathe. I wanted to believe her, wanted to take that apology and press it like a flower between the pages of everything we had lost, but something in her voice made me pause. I asked her why now, and she looked away, then said, because I do not have anyone else. I nodded slowly and told her I appreciated the apology, but forgiveness was a process, not a button I could just push. She looked frustrated, then smiled again and said, I get it, baby steps, right? We parted ways after that, and she texted me later saying it meant a lot to her that I showed up. I stared at the message for a while, then put my phone down without replying. Over the next few months, we kept in light contact messages here and there, but I stayed cautious, like someone learning to swim. Again after nearly drowning, Mia noticed the shift and asked if I was okay. I told her I did not know, but I was trying, and that seemed like enough for now. Then came November, and with it another invitation, this time to Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, a gathering I had skipped for 2 years. Message from my mom said Hailey will be there, and we would love to have you too, and I felt my chest tighten at the idea of walking into that house again, sitting at that table, surrounded by people who had once made me feel like a guest in my own life. I talked it over with Mia, and she said, you do not owe anyone your peace, Erin, not even blood, but if you go, go because you choose to, not because you are guilted into it. I thought about it for days, weighed the pain against the possible closure, and in the end I said yes, not for them, but for me, because I needed to know if I could sit at that table and still hold on to myself. When the day arrived, I wore a soft blue sweater and jeans, nothing fancy, just comfortable and strong. I drove with the windows cracked, letting the cold air remind me that I was alive and no longer afraid. When I walked into the house, my mom hugged me tightly like she had been waiting for that moment. My dad gave a short nod and Hailey waved from the kitchen like we were siblings in a sitcom. I sat at the far end of the table and made small talk with my grandmother, who smiled at me like I was the only person in the room who mattered. The food was good, the conversation light, and for once I did not feel like I was shrinking to fit the space I had been given. Hailey tried to pull me into a conversation about old family vacations, but I steered it toward safer topics: work, the city, the weather. And when dinner ended, I helped clear plates and then told my parents thank you before leaving. No drama, no fight, just a quiet ending to something that used to feel so loud. On the drive home, I played my favorite playlist, Windows Down, Hair Flying Free, and for the first time in years I felt like I had walked through the fire and come out whole, not perfect, not healed, not ready to forget, but stronger than the silence they used to keep me in, and that strength was mine. Winter deepened, and with it came long nights filled with quiet thoughts and unspoken reckonings. I had spent the last year rebuilding myself from the ground up, piece by piece, layer by layer, a kind of healing that no one clapped for because it did not happen on a stage, but in the silent choices I made every day, like not answering calls that made my chest tighten or turning down invitations that felt like guilt dressed in politeness. After Thanksgiving, I had expected the distance to return between me and my family, but instead it shifted into something more confusing, a strange gray area where messages came more often, sometimes from Hailey, sometimes from my mom, sometimes from both. They sent photos of holiday decorations and family updates, as if we had always been this close and nothing had ever broken. I did not respond right away. I needed time to sit with the discomfort of being wanted again, even if it was just performative, even if it was temporary. In December, Hailey called again and asked if I would come over to her apartment for tea. just the two of us, no expectations, no drama, just a talk, I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, because part of me wanted to see what this new version of her looked like. The one who said sorry and asked instead of demanded her place was a neat modern space with neutral walls and cozy throws. She had lit a few candles and made a pot of peppermint tea, which she handed to me with a nervous smile. We sat across from each other, legs folded under us like girls at a sleepover, and for a moment I almost forgot how much space had once existed between us. She asked about my job and my apartment, and listened in a way that felt real and not just polite. I told her about a manuscript I had been editing about a girl who ran away from her family only to discover she had carried their voices inside her all along, and Hailey looked at me with soft eyes and said, "That sounds like you." I did not know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and took a sip of tea. Eventually, she said, "I know I was awful to you for a long time, and I do not expect you to forgive me overnight, but I am trying to be better. I am in therapy now, and it is forcing me to look at things I used to blame you for, things that were never your fault." I felt something in me shift at her words, not because everything was suddenly okay, but because I had waited my whole life for my sister to see me, and now she finally was. I told her thank you and meant it, and when I left her apartment I felt lighter than I had in years. Christmas came, and I stayed in the city again, choosing solitude over tradition. Mia invited me to her family's gathering, but I declined, wanting instead to spend the day in my pajamas watching movies and cooking for myself. I made pancakes in the morning, pasta at noon, and hot cocoa at night, and lit a single candle in the window, because even if no one else saw it, I wanted to mock the fact that I had made it through a year that nearly broke me on New Year's Eve. Mia and I watched fireworks from her rooftop, bundled in blankets and laughing at the people who had clearly never had champagne before. She looked at me as the sky lit up and said, "This is your year, I know it," and I smiled because somewhere deep down I believed her. January was cold and quiet, filled with long work days and short nights, but I did not mind. I had goals, deadlines to meet, books to finish, and one evening, while cleaning out my desk, I found the old invitation to Hailey's wedding still tucked between receipts and forgotten to-do lists. I held it for a moment, studying the gold print and remembering how small I had felt when it arrived, how powerless it made me feel. And then I tore it in half, slowly, methodically, not out of rage, but out of release. It no longer had power over me. It was just paper, just ink, and I was no longer that girl who had begged to be seen. February brought a surprise email from my dad asking if I would meet him for lunch. I stared at it for 10 full minutes, unsure what to make of it. I had not spoken to him one-on-one since the day he gave me that ultimatum in the kitchen, and the thought of sitting across from him again made my stomach twist. But I said yes, not because I wanted to reconnect, but because I wanted to say the things I never had. The lunch spot he chose was a quiet restaurant near the river, all glass windows and soft lighting. He arrived first, already seated with a menu in his hand. When I approached, he stood and gave a small nod before sitting again. We ordered food, made small talk about the weather, about traffic, about nothing. And then he said, "I want to apologize for what I did last year. It was wrong, and I know I hurt you." And I stared at him, unsure whether to speak or let the silence do the work. He continued, "I thought I was doing what was best for the family, for your sister, but I see now that I was punishing you for not falling in line. I want to do better. I want to be better." I asked him why now, and he looked down at his hands before saying, "Because I do not want to lose you, Erin. And I know I already did in some ways, but I want to try." I took a breath, steadying myself before I replied. I told him that his actions had consequences, that I would never forget how it felt to be threatened with my future, that trust once broken was hard to rebuild. But I appreciated the apology. He nodded and said, "I do not expect you to forgive me today. I just want to start again." I left that lunch feeling like I had closed a door, not slammed it, just gently clicked it shut behind me. Because sometimes healing is not about opening old wounds, but letting them scar over, and deciding not to pick at them anymore. Spring crept in slowly, melting snow and softening the air, and with it came news from Hailey. She had filed for separation from Trevor. She called me crying, saying she felt like a failure, like she had built her life around appearances, and now the cracks were showing. I listened quietly, offering her the same kind of presence I had once longed for, and after a while she said, "I envy you, Erin. You always knew who you were. I never did." And in that moment I saw her clearly, not as my rival, not as the golden child, but as a woman unraveling, trying to find her own truth. And I told her it is never too late to start again. We are all just figuring it out, one mistake at a time, and she cried harder, then thanked me for being there. Later that week, my mom sent a message asking if we could all meet for brunch, a fresh start, she called it, and I said yes, not for them, but for me, because I wanted to know if peace was possible, even if it was fragile and temporary. And that brunch turned out to be the first time we all sat at the same table, without pretense, without performance, just people trying to be less broken. And in that quiet, clumsy way we began again. That brunch meeting marked the start of something I had never experienced before with my family, not forgiveness, not a perfect reunion, but something quieter and maybe more meaningful, an agreement to stop pretending things had never happened, and instead try to move forward anyway. It was awkward at first, full of long silences and polite questions like "How is work?" and "What have you been reading lately?" But there was no tension, not like before, and when Hailey spilled her coffee and laughed at herself, it did not feel forced or fake. For the first time I saw my parents not as figures who had held power over my life, but as two people trying to reconnect with a daughter they had once pushed aside. My mom kept glancing at me like she was memorizing my face. My dad mostly listened, asking a few careful questions, and nodding as if taking mental notes. I left that brunch feeling uncertain but not angry, which was new, and the following week something even more unexpected happened. Hailey invited me to a support group she had started, attending a space for women rebuilding themselves after emotional trauma. She said it helped her confront a lot of the behaviors she had ignored, and that she wanted me to come not as a gesture of guilt, but because she thought it might give me something too. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and the next Thursday evening we sat in a circle of folding chairs in a community hall, surrounded by soft lighting and strangers who spoke with raw, honest voices about pain and resilience. I listened more than I spoke, and for the first time in a long time I felt the weight of my own survival and the quiet courage it took to still be here, still standing, still trying. I went back the next week, then the next, and before long I started sharing small pieces of my story. Shame of being overlooked, the ache of being compared, the silent fury of being used as leverage for someone else's happiness. And every time I spoke, I felt something loosen inside, like bricks being removed from a wall one by one. Hailey and I never sat side by side. We always gave each other space. Afterward, we would walk to a small bakery nearby and split a pastry, sometimes in silence, sometimes in reflection. And though it was never spoken out loud, we both knew we were rebuilding not what we had, but what could exist now, separate from the past, rooted in honesty and effort. While my work life was shifting in ways I had not expected, after several successful projects, I was offered a lead editor role at the publishing firm. And though the title was small, the responsibility was not. I found myself mentoring interns, coordinating submissions, and pitching new ideas to executives who finally saw my value. I decorated my desk with plants and sticky notes and a tiny framed quote from a book that had saved me once. It read, "Your story is not over just because someone else tried to end it." The same week I got promoted, Mia received a job offer in another city, and though I was thrilled for her, the thought of her leaving hit me like cold wind. She had been my anchor, my mirror, my daily reminder that I was not alone. And when we packed her things into boxes and loaded the van, I hugged her so tight I thought my ribs might crack. She whispered into my ear, "I am only one call away," and I nodded, knowing full well that even if miles stretched between us, she would always be part of the foundation I stood on. After she left, I went through a strange period of quiet, not loneliness exactly, but the kind of stillness that makes you sit with yourself longer than you want to. I filled my evenings with books and solo walks and long journal entries, trying to understand what it meant to be content on your own terms without the echo of someone else's voice shaping your choices. And during one of those walks I saw something that stopped me cold, a father and daughter on a park bench laughing over an ice cream cone. The girl, maybe 8 years old, was waving her hands as she talked, and the father listened so intently, like she was telling him the secrets of the universe. And I felt this tight ache in my chest because I had never had that, not once, and even though I had made peace with it, there were Still days when the absence of that kind of love felt like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I sat on a nearby bench and just watched them, not with jealousy, but with grief for what never was and maybe never would be later. That night, I called my grandmother and told her how I felt. She listened quietly, then said something I never forgot: just because someone did not give you the love you deserved does not mean you were not worthy of it. And that sentence settled into my bones like warmth in winter. As spring came again, life moved forward steadily. I was thriving at work, attending the support group weekly, reconnecting with pieces of myself I had forgotten, and slowly, very slowly, building a new kind of relationship with my family. We were not close, but we were no longer strangers, and sometimes that was enough. Hailey invited me to a small gathering at her place, a few friends, some food. Nothing fancy, and I agreed more comfortably. This time when I arrived, she hugged me without hesitation, introduced me to her friends as the sister who survived more than any of us knew, and when I laughed, she laughed too, not mockingly, not with pride, just with quiet admiration. I stayed longer than I planned, and when I left, she walked me to the elevator and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance to grow." I told her thank you for trying, and we both smiled like people who knew the road was long but worth walking. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail from my dad, handwritten on thick paper. It was not long, just a few paragraphs, but it said what I had always needed to hear. He wrote that he had failed me in many ways, that he saw now how his actions had shaped me, not in strength, but in survival, and that he was proud of the woman I had become, not despite him, but in defiance of him. He ended it with, "I hope one day you can forgive me, but if you cannot, I will understand." And I wept, not because the pain had gone, but because I no longer needed it to define me. I kept that letter with my grandmother's, folded together like bookmarks in a story that was still being written. A few days later, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, really looked, not to criticize, not to fix, but to witness. I saw the girl who had once begged for love, and the woman who no longer did. I saw strength I had earned, resilience I had built, and peace. I was finally learning to accept. I did not know what the future held, if my family would stay on this path or fall back into silence, if Hailey would keep healing or slide into old habits, if my dad's words would stay true or fade with time. But I knew one thing: I was no longer waiting for them to catch up. I was walking forward on my own feet, at my own pace, with my own voice, and that was enough. By the time summer returned, the version of me that once sat in my childhood bedroom feeling powerless and invisible had become a distant echo of who I was now. I walked with a kind of quiet certainty, not because everything was perfect, but because I had made it through the worst parts without losing the core of who I was. I had learned to build safety in my own skin, to trust the rhythm of my own heartbeat, even when everything around me felt uncertain. Work had become a space where I thrived, not just in performance, but in confidence. I was trusted to lead projects, to mentor younger editors, and speak up in rooms that once intimidated me. I stopped doubting my voice and started using it more boldly, pitching stories that mattered, challenging ideas that felt shallow, and offering support to those still finding their footing. And even though the hours were long and the deadlines relentless, I felt a sense of purpose that grounded me on days when the rest of life felt blurry outside of work. I found myself reconnecting with parts of myself I had forgotten. I started reading poetry again, walking through bookstores with no intention to buy, just to breathe the words off shelves like air. I picked up painting again, clumsy brush strokes on cheap canvases that were more therapy than art. And every time I dipped the brush in color, I felt like I was reclaiming a joy that had once been smothered by expectations. My apartment began to fill with small signs of life, not just plants and furniture, but warmth, candles, half-burned open books, mugs with chipped handles, all of it mine, chosen not for anyone else, but simply because they made me feel good. One afternoon, while rearranging my bookshelf, I found a dusty box tucked behind old textbooks, and when I opened it, I saw pieces of my old life: high school journals, photos from college, a necklace my mom had given me when I turned 16, and a birthday card from Hailey the year before things fell apart. I sat on the floor, flipping through the pieces of a life that once felt too painful to remember, and realized something had shifted. I was no longer haunted by these things. They were no longer evidence of betrayal, but chapters of a story that led me here, and I no longer felt the urge to rewrite them only to understand them. That same week, Hailey invited me to join her for a weekend retreat for women in transition. She said it was something. Her support group was organizing a mix of nature therapy, reflection, and healing circles. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready for that kind of emotional exposure again. But she said it was okay to come and just be silent if I needed, so I said yes, and we drove up together early Saturday morning. The retreat was nestled in the hills, surrounded by trees and soft winds, and the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt something in me exhale for the first time in weeks. The days were filled with movement, yoga, journaling, nature walks, group sessions around campfires where women shared stories that cracked open every wall I had ever built. I listened to strangers speak truths I had never had the courage to say out loud, and in those stories I saw reflections of myself, not exact but close enough to make me cry. And when it was finally my turn to speak, I told them about the kitchen conversation with my dad, about the tuition threat, about the years of silence, and the slow, fragile climb back to myself. I did not cry when I spoke, not because I was strong, but because I had already cried enough to fill oceans, and now the pain felt shaped and known, not overwhelming, just present and contained. And when I finished, Hailey reached across the circle and held my hand, not with apology but with solidarity, and in that moment I believed her not as the sister who once hurt me, but as the woman who was also healing from the shadows of our past. On the last night of the retreat, we each released something into the fire, something symbolic of what we wanted to leave behind. I tossed in the corner of the wedding invitation. I'd saved the part with my name written in calligraphy, the part that once felt like a weapon, and as the paper curled into flame, I felt something final settle in my chest. I was done letting that moment define me. We drove back in silence, both of us wrapped in our own thoughts. And when she dropped me off, she said, "I hope you know I am proud of who you have become." And I said, "I am too," for both of us. Life after that retreat slowed down in the best way, not boring, just peaceful. I still had hard days, still had moments when the old voice in my head whispered that I was not enough, but those voices no longer ran the show. They were just background noise. I had learned how to turn the volume down. I started volunteering at a literacy center on weekends, helping young girls find their voices through writing, and every time one of them wrote a sentence that made them light up, I remembered how powerful it is to be heard, really heard. One Saturday, after a workshop, a girl handed me a drawing she had made of me with a cape, and said, "You are my hero," and I smiled because I had never wanted to be anyone's hero, just someone who survived with grace, but maybe that was enough to make me heroic in someone's eyes. My grandmother continued sending letters, always in her careful cursive, always full of wisdom and warmth, and one day she wrote, "You are the legacy I am proud to leave behind." And that sentence stayed on my fridge, written in magnets to remind me on hard mornings that I came from strength, even if it skipped a generation. And one evening out of nowhere, my dad called just to say he had read a book I recommended and liked it, and that small sentence felt bigger than all apologies in the world, because it meant he was trying not just to reach me, but to know me. And I told him thank you, not for the call, but for the effort, because I had learned to value action over words, and that lesson had changed everything. Slowly, I started seeing them not as villains of my story, as flawed characters with their own pain and blindness, people who made mistakes and sometimes repeated them, but also people who had the capacity to change if they wanted to. I no longer needed their validation, but I no longer carried hatred either, and that balance felt like peace, real, deep, lasting peace, the kind that does not come from resolution, but from acceptance. And every day I woke up in that space felt like a victory, like I had built something unshakable out of the ruins of something once fragile, and all of it was mine. As autumn crept in with its gold leaves and early dusks, I found myself reflecting more deeply on how far I had come, and how far I still wanted to go. It was a strange, quiet kind of transformation, not the kind you post online or announce at gatherings, but the kind that settles in your bones, changes how you breathe, how you walk into a room, how you answer the phone when your father calls without demanding anything, and simply asks, "How are you, Er?" and it had taken me years to understand that healing is not a single moment but a slow layering of truths over pain, a process of choosing yourself again and again, even on the days when it would be easier to fall back into silence. One evening, I was walking home from work, the air crisp and the sky dimming, when I saw a little girl spinning in circles on the sidewalk, her laughter echoing against the buildings as her father stood near. By smiling, his hands tucked into his coat, she reminded me of myself at that age, before the weight of expectations, before the comparisons, before the unspoken rule that I would always come second. And as I watched her twirl, I felt this overwhelming sense of protection rise in me, not just for her, but for the version of myself who never got to be that free. When I got home, I pulled out one of my old journals and wrote a letter to my younger self. I told her I was sorry for all the times she felt alone, all the nights she cried without being comforted, all the birthdays she shared with her sister's celebrations. Because Hailey's events were always louder, shinier, more important, I told her she did not deserve to be made small, so others could feel big, that her voice mattered even when it shook, that her dreams were not silly, and that love should never have been conditional. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box where I kept the letters from my grandmother and my dad, not because I needed to revisit it, but because it belonged with the things that taught me how to survive. The weeks that followed were full of subtle shifts. My mother started texting me about ordinary things like recipes she tried or shows she had watched, and even though her messages still carried the polite tone of someone testing the waters, I could tell she was trying. Hailey sent me a photo of an old diary she had found in her closet, one that had notes between us from when we were children. I had forgotten we used to patch folded papers between rooms when we were not allowed to stay up and talk. We would write silly things, jokes, dreams, plans, and somehow in that moment I felt the thread between us stretch, not from obligation, but memory, something real from before everything went sideways. She said, "Do you remember this?" And I replied yes with a smile that came easily later. That month, our support group planned a weekend hike, a full day in the woods with nothing but backpacks, food, and each other. I almost skipped it, too tired from work, too mentally full from life. But something in me said go, and so I did. The trail was long and winding, covered in red leaves and soft earth, and as we walked we shared stories, not just the ones about pain, but about strength, joy, mistakes, love. I talked about my job, and how strange it felt to be respected in a world that once ignored me. I talked about Mia, and how some friendships are so deep they become part of your DNA. I talked about my family, and how it was still complicated, still delicate, but no longer destructive. And one woman said, "You sound like someone who built herself a second chance," and I nodded, because yes, that is exactly what I had done. Near the end of the hike, we reached a small clearing where sunlight broke through the trees, and someone suggested we each pick up a stone and whisper into it the thing we were still carrying that we wanted to let go. I found a flat, smooth rock, held it close, and said out loud the guilt of surviving in a house that did not know how to love me. Then I placed it on the ground and walked away. It felt small and massive all at once, like taking off a coat I did not realize I had been wearing for years. That night, back in my apartment, I stood in front of the mirror again, the same one I had once used to judge every flaw, but this time I looked at myself and saw the woman who had walked through fire without turning to ash. I saw the girl who once sat in a back row at her sister's wedding, afraid to breathe too loud, and the woman who now spoke in meetings with her head high, who laughed freely, who cried when she needed to, and never apologized for either. I saw someone whole, not perfect, not healed in the way fairy tales promise, but whole in her brokenness, which is sometimes even more powerful. A few days later, I received an email from a former professor congratulating me on being featured in an online article about young editors shaping the future of publishing. I had not even known I had been nominated, and when I clicked the link and read my name beside words like powerful, clear, authentic, I felt the corners of my mouth lift in a way that was soft and proud. I printed the article and sent a copy to my grandmother, called me the next day crying, telling me, "I knew it, I always knew it. You are the light they tried to cover, but you kept shining." I thanked her and told her that she was part of the reason I never gave up. And she said, "Then pass that strength forward." Erin and I promised I would. 1 week after that, my Father called again, this time to ask if I would join him for a community event. He was sponsoring something about youth development and mentorship. He said he thought I might be a good speaker, that my story could help others, and for the first time I did not feel suspicious of his motives. I said I would think about it, and when the day came I stood on that stage, microphone in hand, lights low, crowd quiet, and I told them about resilience, not as an idea, but as a reality. I told them about the girl who almost gave up, and the woman who never will, about pain that becomes purpose, about the kind of power that is quiet, steady, and unstoppable. And when I stepped down, my father hugged me, not stiff, not distant, but real, his eyes damp, his voice rough. When he said, "I am proud of you," I held that moment like a photograph, and later that night I cried, not from pain, but from release, because I had been waiting my entire life to be seen, and finally I was. The days that followed that moment on stage felt like stepping through a door I had been standing in front of for years, a door I had knocked on, begged at, cried near, and finally learned to open myself. There was no sudden applause, no dramatic music, just peace, deep, real peace, the kind that lives in your body like breath. I kept moving forward with my life, not as an escape from the past, but as proof that I had made it through. I woke up each morning with a sense of clarity I had never known before, and even when doubt crept in, I knew how to face it now, not with fear, but with truth. My apartment began to feel less like a place I was passing through and more like a home. My work was fulfilling and steady. My voice in the office carried weight, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. I was asked to lead more projects, trusted to make final calls, and even sat in on meetings with executives who used to barely glance at my name tag. And though the pressure was real, it felt good to be pushed, to be challenged, to be needed, and not ignored. Outside of work, things with my family had settled into something that resembled warmth, not fire, but warmth. My mother started inviting me over for quiet dinners, just the two of us, where we talked about books and memories and sometimes even regret. She once looked at me across the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and said, "I wish I had listened to you more," and I knew it was the closest thing to an apology she could give, and it was enough. Hailey and I were still rebuilding slowly, layer by layer. She started asking about my life, not out of politeness but curiosity, and when I told her about my next career steps, she lit up with genuine pride, saying, "You have always been the brave one," and that caught me off guard, because for so long I had believed I was the invisible one, the lesser one, the forgotten one, but maybe all along I was just the one who had to learn strength the hard way. One evening she showed up at my apartment, unannounced, holding a box she said she had found in our parents' attic. Inside were old drawings, notes shared between us as kids, a worn-out friendship bracelet, and a photo of us from when we were maybe 10, standing in the backyard with chalk on our faces and mischief in our eyes. She said, "I want you to have this. I think it belongs with you." And I took it, not because I needed the items, but because I needed the gesture, and that meant more than anything that could fit inside a box. Around that same time, my grandmother's health began to decline. She had always been strong, always steady, always the one person who never wavered in her love for me, and watching her grow smaller, more tired, more quiet, broke something in me. I visited her every week, bringing flowers, books, her favorite cookies, and sitting beside her as she told me stories of her youth, of mistakes and triumphs, and the lessons she had learned. She once said, "Life is not about being right, and it is about being real, and if you can be real with yourself, you can survive anything." Those words stayed with me during the nights I stayed up worrying about her, about losing the only person who had loved me without condition. And one evening, as I was leaving her house, she pressed something into my hand. It was a ring, delicate gold with a tiny stone. She said it was her mother's, and then hers, and now mine, "because you are the strongest woman I know." And I cried in my car for a long time after that, because there is something about being seen by someone who knows all your cracks and still calls you whole that makes you believe it too. In the middle of all this, my dad called and asked if I wanted to come with him to a conference. He was speaking at a leadership event in another state, and though my first instinct was hesitation, I agreed, because I wanted to know what it would be like to travel with him as equals, as adults, as people trying to move forward. We flew out on a Friday morning, the plane ride quiet, but not tense. He asked about my work, I asked about his, and we talked like colleagues, sharing ideas and laughing about airport coffee. When we arrived at the hotel, he handed me my own key card and said, "I know you like your Space, and that small gesture meant more than any speech he could have rehearsed the next day at the event. I watched him speak with passion and clarity, and when he introduced me to his peers, he said, "This is my daughter Erin. She is a force," and I smiled not because I needed his praise, but because I knew I had earned it. After the event, we had dinner together at a small local place and talked about everything and nothing at once. And before we parted for the night, he said, "I still have a long way to go, but thank you for giving me the chance to try." And I said, "I still have a lot of walls, but thank you for not trying to knock them down just for standing near them." And we both understood that this was our new beginning, not flashy, not perfect, just honest. And that was enough. When we returned home, I went straight to my grandmother's house to tell her about the trip. She smiled weakly, her hand trembling a bit as she reached for mine, and said, "I knew he would come around eventually. I just hoped he would do it while you still needed him." I told her I do not need him anymore, but it is nice to be wanted, and she laughed, that soft, quiet laugh that always made me feel safe. That fall, I was invited to speak at a local university about women in publishing, and when I stood in front of those students, wide-eyed and eager, I told them the truth about struggle, about family, about choosing your own path, even when the world tells you to stay silent. I told them that power is not always loud, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away and build something better. And afterward, a girl came up to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "Your story is mine." And in that moment, I felt everything come full circle. Every time I had felt unseen, every word I had swallowed, every wound I had carried, had led to this moment of being the voice for someone else. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already won, because I had taken my pain and made it a bridge, and I was never going back to who I used to be. It was sometime in late October when I realized the greatest change in my life had not been my job title, or the growing respect I received from colleagues, or even the fragile healing happening with my family. It was something smaller, quieter, but more profound. I no longer waited for permission to feel proud of myself. I no longer sought validation in glances or texts or phone calls that never came. I had started living for the version of me who once stood in the corner of every room, hoping someone would notice her. I had become my own witness, my own advocate, and my own steady flame. One morning, while walking to work, I passed a mirror shop and caught my reflection in the glass, not dressed up, not made up, just real hair pulled back, eyes alert, shoulders upright. And I stopped and looked at myself, not to criticize, but to say, "There you are, finally there you are." The week after that, I got a call from the head of my department asking if I would consider mentoring a new hire, a young woman fresh out of university, who reminded them of me, not the me now, but the me who had first walked through those doors with nervous energy and quiet determination. I said yes, because I remembered how much it meant to be guided, not corrected, not controlled, but supported. And when I met her, I saw in her that same hunger I once carried, that same fear that maybe she did not belong. And I told her, "You do belong, you just have to stop asking for permission to take up space." And I saw something in her face shift, a little lighter, a little more certain, and I knew then that I had stepped into a new season, not just of survival, but of leadership, and I intended to carry it with care. Around that same time, Hailey invited me to a small gathering at our parents' house, just a dinner, nothing fancy, just us and them. I hesitated at first, still remembering the sting of that kitchen conversation from so long ago, but then I said yes, not because I owed them anything, but because I owed myself the right to walk into that house without carrying the weight of old silence. When I arrived, the table was already set. My mom was humming in the kitchen, Hailey was placing napkins, and my dad was pouring drinks. It looked almost too normal, which made it even stranger. He looked up and smiled, said, "Glad you made it." And I nodded, saying thanks for the invite. We ate and talked about books, about work, about music, from when we were kids, and for the first time in years it felt like I was not being measured or compared, just seen. My mom asked about a recent article that had quoted me, and I explained it simply, and she said, "I always knew you would do something important. I just wish I had told you sooner." And that moment landed like a soft stone in my chest, not heavy, but still. There, after dinner, we sat in the living room and talked about memories, old photos, albums I had not seen in years, and somewhere in between the pages of birthday pictures and holiday snapshots, I found a photo of me alone in a field, wearing a crown of leaves, smiling so wide it almost hurt, and I asked where this was from, and my dad said that was the day you won that writing contest. You were so proud, and I had completely forgotten it, but he had not, and in that moment something shifted between us, not erased, but softened. I left that night feeling like maybe we were learning how to hold space for each other, not perfectly, but intentionally. The following weekend, I got an email from a nonprofit organization asking if I would consider speaking at a youth conference for girls facing family trauma. They had read my article, heard my name through it. Mutual contact, and believed my story could help others. I said yes without hesitation, and when I stood on that stage weeks later and looked out at rows of girls with wide eyes and guarded hearts, I told them the truth. I told them about the pain, about the distance, about the threats and ultimatums and years of feeling invisible. I told them about finding their voice even when it shakes, about writing their own names into the story and not letting anyone else hold the pen. And when I stepped off stage, dozens of them came up to hug me, to thank me, to share their own stories, and I knew then that all the nights I cried in silence, all the days I walked around feeling like an afterthought, had led me to this exact moment of being someone else's evidence that it is possible to make it out and make it matter. I returned home that night, exhausted but full, and when I opened the door to my apartment, there was a package waiting, a small box wrapped in brown paper with my name written in neat handwriting. I opened it to find a necklace, simple gold, with a tiny engraved word, brave. No note, no card, just that, and I knew without needing to ask that it was from Hailey, a quiet offering, a recognition, and I wore it the next day and every day after, not because I needed a symbol of strength, but because it reminded me of the journey, of the climb, of the fire I had walked through, and the light I had become. Later that month, my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep, and the call came early in morning, my mom's voice soft and shaking, and I just whispered okay and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the loss wash over me, slow and aching. The funeral was small, full of soft hymns and soft tears, and when I stood to speak, I did not read from notes. I just spoke from memory about the woman who loved me first and most, who never asked me to be anyone but myself, who reminded me through every letter, every call, every visit, that I was worthy and whole and seen. I told them she taught me that legacy is not about big names or big stages, but about how deeply you love the people who need it most. And when I stepped down, there were tears and nods and hugs, but all I wanted was to sit by her grave one last time and whisper thank you after the service. My dad held my hand for a long time and said she would be so proud of you, and I said I hope so, and he said I know so, and maybe for once I believed him. That night I sat in my apartment, candles lit, favorite book in my lap, and wrote a final letter to my grandmother. I told her about the girls I spoke to, about the way my father looked at me, about the necklace Hailey had sent. I told her I was okay, and that I would keep going, and that I would pass her strength forward. And I folded that letter and tucked it into the same envelope that held hers, and I knew I would carry her with me always. The weeks after my grandmother's funeral moved like shadows across the walls, soft and slow and always present. I went back to work, but everything felt slightly muted, like the colors around me had dimmed and the sounds were quieter than before. I was functioning, doing the things expected of me, turning in drafts, leading meetings, giving notes, but somewhere inside a door had closed, and I did not know how to open it again. I missed her in ways I could not explain, in ways I could not even name. It was not just about losing her voice or her letters or her warmth. It was about losing the one person who never once asked me to be anything but myself. She had been my anchor, my witness, my shelter, and without her I felt like I was standing in a world that no longer had corners to lean in to, and I found myself walking through her memories like they were rooms in a house I had to keep visiting to feel close to her. I reread every letter she had written, every message, every piece of advice she had given me when I felt too tired to go on, and I lit a candle for her every night near the window and whispered a thank you into the dark. I kept working because work gave my hands something to do. Even when my heart felt heavy, and most nights I would come home and sit in silence, letting the day unravel in my chest until it faded into sleep. And I told myself grief was not something to fix, only something to carry, and I was learning how to carry it with grace even when it pulled at my shoulders. Like a weight I would never be rid of. One evening as I was leaving the office, Hailey called, her voice low and soft, and she said, "I miss her too, and I know you probably think I had more of her, but I didn't. She gave you her love and gave me her prayers, and sometimes I think that was her way of trying to reach me." And I told her maybe that was her way of loving us both in the ways we needed. And Hailey asked if she could come over so we could go through some of her things together, and I said yes because I was tired of grieving alone and needed someone else who had known her, not just loved her, but understood the way her kindness could break through walls. Hailey arrived with a box of her old scarves and teacups and photographs, and we spread everything out on the floor and went through each piece like we were brushing dust off pieces of the past. There was a photo of my grandmother as a young woman standing barefoot in a field, smiling so wide you could feel the sunlight in the image, and Hailey stared at it for a long time before saying, "I never realized how strong she was," and I replied, "She never needed to say it, she just lived it," and Hailey nodded, her eyes wet, her voice barely above a whisper. I wish I had listened more, and I said, "Me too," and we sat there in silence, letting the truth settle between us, not as blame, but as understanding. Later that night, as she was leaving, she turned to me at the door and said, "Thank you for letting me be here for this," and I said, "Thank you for showing up," and we both knew we meant more than just tonight. In the weeks that followed, I started writing again, not just for work, but for myself. Pages and pages of thoughts, letters, essays, and unfinished poems, things I had held back for years, began to pour out of me like they had been waiting all this time for space. And one day I wrote a full piece about my grandmother and submitted it anonymously to a magazine that focused on healing and grief, and 3 weeks later I got an email saying they wanted to publish it, and when I saw the words in print, the title, "A Name Only I Knew Was Mine," I felt a surge of peace, because somewhere in those words was her voice living on, speaking through me, echoing into places she never got to see. Around that same time, I was asked to lead a project that had stalled for months, a book about family reconciliation, and the editor said she thought I was perfect for it because I seemed to understand the gray areas, the places between love and silence. And when I read the draft, I felt a jolt in my chest because the story mirrored so much of my own, and I knew this was not just another project. It was a mirror, a map, a way of helping others find the same light I had found. I poured myself into the work, staying late, asking hard questions, editing with care, and when it was finally done, I sent a copy to my mom and another to Hailey, not to show off, but to share a piece of the healing they had helped me reach, and both of them called to say how proud they were. And for once it did not feel like a performance, it felt real. That fall, Hailey and I took a trip together, a short weekend to the coast, just to get away and breathe and remember what it felt like to laugh without trying too hard. We walked the beach barefoot, collecting shells and telling stories we had never shared before. She told me about the pressure she always felt to be perfect, the fear of losing our parents' approval, the resentment she carried every time they compared her to some version of herself she could not live up to. And I told her about the ache of being invisible, the way silence had shaped me, the guilt I carried for walking away, and she looked at me and said we were both broken in different directions, and maybe now we are just finding our way back. And I said maybe, and we sat on the sand in the fading light, watching the waves roll in, and I felt something inside me settle for the first time in a long while. I felt safe and whole and free. We returned home, changed, not dramatically, but quietly, like wind smoothing the edges of something jagged, and we kept talking more often, softer, kinder, and one night she called just to say, "I love you," and I said it back, not because I felt obligated, but because I meant it, and because it was time to say the things we never thought we would say. I kept writing, kept working, kept waking up every morning knowing I was exactly where I was meant to be, not because life was perfect, but because I was living it fully, with all its mess and beauty and loss and love, and somewhere in all of it I had found myself. The year began to close in a way that did not feel loud or final, but steady and full, like the long fade at the end of a beautiful song. And as the air cooled and the days grew shorter, I found myself reflecting more than usual, not because I was chasing closure, but because I was finally able to sit in my own life without feeling the urge to explain it to anyone. I was proud, not just of what I had survived, but of who I had become in the process, not a perfect version of myself, but a version that was real, grounded, and whole. I walked to work each day bundled in my coat with my bag over my shoulder, passing familiar streets that once felt like escape routes and now felt like landmarks of my healing. I made tea at night and listened to quiet music read books that reminded me of who I was before the world told me to shrink, and slowly began to understand that peace does not always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with routines, with gentle choices, with the way you say no without guilt and yes without fear. Hailey and I kept talking regularly, and while the conversations were sometimes clumsy or filled with pauses, we were trying and trying. Is holy in its own way. We went out for brunch one Sunday at a place we used to visit with our mom when we were teenagers and sat in the same booth and laughed about how much smaller it felt, and Hailey looked at me and said, "I used to hate how easy everything looked for you," and I stared at her stunned because I had always thought opposite, and I said I thought you were the one who had it all, and we both laughed and then grew quiet, and Hailey said maybe we were just hurting in opposite corners, and I nodded and said maybe, and that felt like a truth worth holding on to, one that explained more than any argument we had ever had. That winter, I was invited to speak at a national women's conference about resilience and leadership, and though I was nervous, I knew I needed to do it because the story was no longer just mine. It was a thread in a much larger fabric of women who had been told they were too much or not enough, who had been silenced or sidelined or shaped by expectations they never agreed to. And I wanted them to hear from someone who had been there, someone who had walked out and rebuilt her voice from the pieces. The stage was massive lights, hot crowd, wide and waiting. And as I stepped up to the microphone, I took a deep breath and told a story, not the polished version, but the real one, about the girl who sat in the back row of a wedding, pretending not to cry, about the sister who once mocked her, and the father who once threatened to take away everything, about the loneliness and the silence and the long hard road back. And then I told them about the woman who rose anyway, who stood anyway, who healed anyway, and by the end there were tears and standing applause. But what mattered most to me was the line of women who came up afterwards, some with stories, others with silence, and one of them just hugged me and whispered I needed to know I was not alone, and I said, "You never were that night." Hailey called and said, "I read the transcript and cried because I saw myself in your story, and not just the girl who hurt you, but the girl who was lost too." And I said, "Maybe we were both lost, and maybe we are both finding our way back." And she said, "I love you," and I said, "I love you too," and meant it fully, freely, without the shadow of resentment between the words. A few days later, I went to visit my parents for dinner, and when I walked in, the house smelled like roasted vegetables and spices and something sweet in oven. My mom hugged me longer than usual, and my dad asked if I had any new articles coming out, and when I told him about a new publishing offer, his eyes lit up, and he said, "Your grandmother would be over the moon proud," and I said I know she would, and we sat down to eat, and for the first time I felt like I belonged, not because I had earned it, but because I had claimed it. I had made space for myself in this family, not by forcing my way in, but by refusing to leave myself behind. And later, when my mom brought out dessert, she said, "Thank you for not giving up on us," and I said, "Thank you for not pretending nothing ever happened," and we smiled because that was enough truth for now. After dinner, Hailey and I stayed back while our parents cleaned up, and she showed me a photo of a house she was thinking of buying, a little place just outside the city, and she said, "I want it to feel like mine, like really mine." And I said, "Then get it and make it yours, every corner, every plant, every light." And she smiled and said, "I want you to help me pick out the colors." And I said I would love that, and it felt like a promise, not just about paint, but about presence, about choosing each other going forward. I walked home that night under streetlights and a sky full of stars, and I thought about how strange and beautiful life could be, how pain that once felt unbearable had led me to this moment of quiet joy, and how the people who once broke me were slowly learning how to hold me with care. I lit a candle by the window for my grandmother, wrote in my journal for a while, then curled up in bed, feeling safe, not because nothing could hurt me, but because I had already faced the hurt and come out the other side. Spring came with a softness I had not expected, like the world itself was exhaling. After holding its breath for too long, the flowers bloomed early, and the air smelled like renewal, and I felt like the version of myself I had been trying to become was no longer just a dream, but something I woke up With every day, my apartment felt more like home than ever, filled with books and candles and light plants, reaching toward the sun like they believed in something greater. And I started hosting small dinners for the people who had held me up through my darkest hours, colleagues, friends, mentors, and meals, who even from another city kept showing up with messages and calls and jokes that reminded me I had never been alone. She surprised me one weekend with a visit, showing up at my door with a suitcase and a box of pastries, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there, I felt tears rush to my eyes because it had been too long since I had been in the same room with someone who knew all the versions of me and never flinched. She walked into my space like it was hers, like she had never left, and we stayed up all night talking about everything and nothing, about how far we had come and how much we had changed, and about how growth is not always about adding things, sometimes it is about letting go. And she said, "I am proud of you," and I said I would not be here without you, and we clinked glasses and laughed until our sides hurt. The next morning, we walked through the city, revisiting old cafes and shops we used to love, and she said, "You built something beautiful here, Erin," and I looked around and realized she was right. I had carved a life out of stone and silence, and made it bloom. Later that week, Hailey called and said she had finally put an offer on the house, and it had been accepted, and she wanted me to see it first before anyone else. So I took a train to the small, quiet neighborhood, where it stood, a white cottage with blue shutters and a garden out front that looked like it had stories to tell. And when I walked in, I felt something shift, like maybe this was her fresh start, her way of rewriting her own ending. She showed me each room with a kind of hope in her eyes I had never seen before. And when we reached the last room, she said, "I want this to be the guest room, and you better be the first one who stays in it." And I smiled and said I would be honored. We spent the day unpacking boxes and talking about what it means to begin again. And at one point, she pulled out an old binder full of letters and said, "Do you remember these?" And I did. They were letters we wrote each other during summer breaks when we were kids, full of made-up codes and drawings and dreams. And I said we used to believe in everything, and she said maybe we still do, we just forgot for a while. That evening, as we sat on her new porch watching the sunset, she said, "Do you think Dad ever really understood how much he hurt us?" And I was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think he does now, and I think that matters." And she nodded and said, "I hope so, because I do." And that was her way of saying she was sorry again. And I accepted it again, not because the past had disappeared, but because we were both doing the work to make the future different. When I got home that night, I found an envelope in my mailbox from my dad. Inside was a typed letter with a short note in his handwriting that said I could not say it out loud, but I needed you to know. And as I sat on my couch and read his words, I felt something in me break and rebuild all at once. He wrote about the pressure he had always felt to hold everything together, and how in doing so he had become blind to who he was hurting the most. He wrote about Hailey, and how he had spent years protecting her from things that were never real, and about me, and how he had failed to see that I did not need saving, I just needed support. He ended the letter with a line that read, "I know I can never take back what I did, but I want to earn whatever place you might still have for me in your life." And I closed my eyes and let the tears fall, not out of pain, but out of release, because I had waited my entire life to be seen by him. And now here it was, not perfect but real, and that was enough. I wrote him back a few days later, a simple letter that said, "I am still healing, but I see you trying, and that means more than you know." And I left it at that, because sometimes love is not about grand gestures, it is about showing up when it matters without being As the next few weeks moved quickly, work grew busier with new opportunities opening up, and I was invited to co-edit a series on women overcoming generational trauma, which felt like the most natural thing in the world. And Hailey kept sending me photos of her renovations of painted walls and new curtains and mugs she found at antique stores, and she sent one of a small framed quote that said, "Strong women heal and pass it on." And I knew she had chosen it because of us, because of where we had been and where we were going, and it made me smile. My mom started calling more often just to talk, not to pry, and I started letting her in, not all the way but enough. And one day she said, "I wish I had been different back then." And I said, "I know, but I am glad you are different now." and that felt like enough truth for both of us. We were not rewriting the story, we were just writing the next chapter. And that felt like power, not erasure, but transformation. A few nights later, I had a dream that I was sitting at our old family table with my grandmother beside me, and she looked at me and said, "It took you a long time, but you did it," and I woke up with tears on my cheeks and a heart that felt whole in a way I had not known was possible. I lit a candle for her and whispered, "I hope I am making you proud," and I swear for a moment the flame flickered like she was answering back. The last stretch of that year felt like standing on a high mountain after a long, painful climb, with the wind in my face and the valley behind me finally quiet for the first time in so long. I was no longer carrying my story like a weight, but holding it like a banner, not as a victim, but as a survivor, and more than that, as someone who had turned survival into strength. I began to notice how much of the world had changed, not because it truly had, but because I was seeing it differently. People smiled more often, or maybe I just noticed it. Strangers held doors and thanked me, and I felt no urge to shrink, no impulse to apologize for existing. I was walking in my own skin, fully, not trying to escape from it, not trying to trade it for someone else's version of enough. And that was the most liberating feeling I had ever known. I began teaching a weekend writing workshop for young women, and each Saturday the small room would fill with girls holding notebooks like lifelines, and I would watch them pour their hearts onto paper, and I would remind them that their stories were not too much, and their pain was not shameful, and their silence was not weakness, and that sometimes writing truth is the first way we learn how to speak it out loud. One girl asked me if it ever gets easier, and I said no, but it does get lighter, and she wrote that down in the corner of her notebook and smiled like maybe she believed it, and I hoped she did. Hailey was settling into her new house slowly and beautifully, turning each room into a piece of herself. She would send me updates every few days, pictures of new curtained shelves lined with books, fresh flowers on the kitchen table. And one day she sent a photo of the guest room with a note that said, "I hope you stay here soon." And I wrote back, "I will." And I meant it, because her space felt like healing to my dad. And I began meeting once a month for lunch. And though we still sometimes fell into the silence of people trying to unlearn old habits, we were making progress. He would ask about my work, my writing, my students, and he would listen like he really wanted to know, not like he was filling space. And one afternoon he said I was wrong about so many things, and I asked what changed, and he looked at me and said, "You did," and it made me change. And I nodded, because there was nothing else to say that would carry more weight. My mom invited me to join her for a craft fair, and it was strange walking through rows of handmade things with her, like we were just two women finding joy in little things, not a mother and daughter who had spent years on opposite sides of silence. She bought me a small ceramic bowl and said it reminded her of me, not flashy, not fragile, just quietly strong, and I took it home and placed it by my window, and every time I dropped my keys into it, I remembered that healing is not just about what we say, but what we share, what we notice, what we offer when no one is asking. One evening, Hailey called and said she had found an old video of us as kids on a dusty tape hidden in a drawer, and she had it converted to digital and wanted me to come watch it. So I went to her house the next night, and we sat on her couch under a blanket, like we used to during sleepovers when we were small, and the screen lit up with grainy footage of us running through the backyard in mismatched pajamas, blowing bubbles and laughing until we fell down in the grass. And there was a moment where she tripped, and I reached down to help her up, and she looked at me in that video with a kind of trust that felt like gold. And in real time, sitting beside her, I felt tears sting my eyes, and she whispered, "I do not know when I stopped looking at you like that." And I said, "Maybe you never did, maybe we just forgot." And she held my hand and said, "I am sorry again." And I said, "I know," and we sat there in silence, watching those younger versions of ourselves dance in the sun, unaware of how complicated things would become, and grateful that somehow we had found our way back. Hailey told me she had started journaling every day, just like I always told her to, and that it was helping her untangle things she had never been brave enough to say. And I told her that was the point, not to solve it all, but to start. And she nodded and said, "I used to think being strong meant hiding everything, but now I think it means sharing without shame." And I said, "Exactly." And we toasted with tea mugs, and she smiled with her whole face, which I had not seen in years. And I thought maybe this is what forgiveness looks like, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and warm and honest. My work at the publishing house kept growing. I was asked to sit on a panel about ethics in storytelling. And when it was my turn to speak, I said that stories save us not because they fix our past, but because they remind us we are not the only ones trying to outrun it. And the crowd was still in that way that meant they were listening, really listening. And after the panel, one woman approached me and said, "Your words made me call my sister just now for the first time in 6 years," and I hugged her because I knew what that kind of reaching felt like. Hailey later sent me a voice message saying, "I am proud of you. I do not say it enough, but I am, and I saved it not because I needed proof, but because it reminded me how far we had both come." My dad began volunteering at a mentorship program for young men, and when he told me about it, I could hear something in his voice that sounded like purpose. He said, "I want to help them become the kind of fathers they wish they had." And I said, "That is good work." And he said, "I hope so." And we both knew he was doing it for himself as much as for them. I kept lighting a candle for my grandmother every Sunday, still speaking her name, still thanking her for the strength she gave me. And one Sunday, as I sat by the window writing a letter to one in particular, I looked up and whispered, "I think I finally became everything you hoped I would." And in the quiet that followed, I felt peace wrap around me like a blanket, not because everything was perfect, but because I had finally stopped running from who I was and started standing inside it fully. The year turned again, and with it came the kind of clarity that only time and truth can bring. I no longer woke up wondering if I mattered in the eyes of people who once overlooked me. I no longer stood in rooms wondering how to shrink myself to make others comfortable. I had grown into a woman who chose herself again and again without guilt, without apology. And that was the version of me I had fought so long to become. I had learned to take up space in my own life, to speak with a voice that no longer trembled, and to sit at tables where I was once denied a seat, now not out of spite, but out of strength. I had stopped needing closure from people who refused to offer it, and started finding peace in the way I kept moving forward, even when the road behind me was full of cracks and silence. Hailey was doing better too. Her new house was starting to feel lived and layered with memories of warmth, dinners and quiet nights, and walls painted in shades of healing. She called me one morning and said, "I think I want to start writing my own story, not for anyone else, just for me." And I said, "Do it. You have more to say than you think." And she replied, "Maybe that is what you were teaching me all along." And I smiled because she was right. We were all learning from each other now, not through confrontation, but through growth. We had stopped bleeding on each other and started building instead, brick by brick, step by step. My father and I continued to meet, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for lunch, and each conversation felt a little less guarded, a little more human. One afternoon, he said, "I think I spent half my life confusing control with care, and I am sorry for how that hurt you." And I looked at him and said, "Thank you," and that was all it took to close a wound that had been open far too long. My mother started knitting again, something she had given up years ago, and she made me a scarf in the softest blue, and when she handed it to me, she said, "I know I cannot fix the past, but I can be part of the future." And I wrapped it around my neck and said, "Then let us start from here." I began writing my own book. Not for work, not for publishing, just for myself, a memoir of sorts, but not linear, more like a tapestry of memory and reflection, a collection of pages that told the story of a girl who was told to be quiet and learned how to sing anyway, a girl who stood at the edge of her family's love and built her own warmth from scratch. I wrote late into the night's candle-lit, tea in hand, music low and heart wide open. I wrote about the kitchen, the threat, the wedding, the silence, the grief, the rage, the growth, the reconciliation, the forgiveness, the freedom. I wrote about Mia and the rooftop and the girls in writing workshop and the letters from my grandmother. I wrote about the scar that once felt like shame and how it became proof of survival. I did not write to be read. I wrote to remember and to honor the girl I used to be, the girl who refused to disappear in the face of dismissal. One weekend I visited Hailey, and we went to a local bookstore together, and she picked out a novel, and I picked out a journal, and we sat at a nearby cafe, flipping pages and sipping coffee and laughing like time had folded itself neatly back into something soft and usable. She said, I never thought we would get healed. And I said I did not either, and she said, but I am glad we did, and I nodded because I was too. We talked about our dreams, our fears, our plans. And it felt like we were not just sisters, but women finally choosing to see each other as we were and not as we had been told to be that night. She made dinner, and we watched an old movie, and at the end she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered thank you for not giving up on me. And I said thank you for finding your way back to me. And in that moment I felt something close for good, not in grief, but in grace, like a chapter ending exactly where it should and a new one beginning, not in urgency, but in choice. A few weeks later, I was invited to deliver the closing speech at a youth empowerment event. The theme was becoming, and I stood at the podium, heart steady, voice strong, and I said becoming is not always a light-filled thing. Sometimes it is clawing your way out of silence. Sometimes it is losing everything you thought you needed just to realize you were enough without it. Sometimes it is standing at the edge of your own life and choosing to walk back into it fully. Becoming is not about being fearless, it is about being honest. And if you are honest long enough, you will find your way home. And when I stepped off that stage, I felt lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because I had learned how to carry it differently. I went home that night and opened the last letter my grandmother had written to me, the one she left in her will. The one marked read only when ready, and I was ready. It said, you are the light I always knew would survive even when the world told you not to believe in your shine, and I hope you keep shining, not to prove anyone wrong, but to show others what is possible. And I held that letter to my heart and cried, not because I was sad, but because I was so deeply alive. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet sky, the kind that holds promise and breath, and I looked at myself in the mirror, the same girl, the same woman, the same fire, and I said out loud, I am proud of you, and I meant every word, because I had finally become someone. I did not need to escape from someone. I wanted to know more, someone who had taken pain and made purpose, someone who had walked through every door meant to keep her out and built a room of her own and filled it with light. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.